I never told my son what was waiting for him at the lake house. He didn't know it existed. Not really. Not as anything more than a blurred memory of childhood summers, the smell of pine, resin in the heat, his mother's laughter traveling across the water before he could even see her face. He thought it was just a place, a family property, something old and sentimental, that fathers keep because they don't know how to let go of the past. He had no idea it was a vault, not a vault full of money, not a vault full of anything you could carry out in a camera bag, a vault full of something else entirely, something that took Margaret 30 years to build and 4 years of knowing. She was dying to make sure couldn't be touched. I want to tell you about the Saturday in October when it all came to a head. But to do that right, I have to go back further. I have to tell you about Margaret first, because this story, all of it, every single piece, begins and ends with her. My wife Margaret grew up in a small town outside of Sudbury, the youngest of 4 kids in a family that had very little money and a great deal of pride about it. She put herself through university, studied business administration, and spent 15 years working in estate administration before Daniel was born. 15 years of sitting across from grieving families, while lawyers divided up what their loved ones had left behind. She used to say that job taught her more about human nature than anything she'd studied in school. She'd seen brothers stop speaking over a dining room table. She'd seen daughters contest wills over jewelry that had no monetary value but carried 40 years of resentment inside it. She'd seen second wives arrive at probate hearings with lawyers and laptops and expressions of absolute certainty about what they were owed. She'd seen families that had been close and loving and genuinely good to each other discover in the months after a death that grief and money are a combination that can crack almost any foundation if you haven't poured it carefully. Margaret poured our foundation carefully. When she was diagnosed, breast cancer, stage 3, the spring Daniel turned 30, she didn't panic. She grieved privately, the way she did most things, and then she moved. Within 6 weeks of the diagnosis, she was sitting across from our lawyer, Peter Gallagher, in his office on Spruce Street in Timmins, telling him exactly how she wanted everything structured and why. Everything went into a family trust, the lake house on Wabun Lake, which had been her parents' property and then ours. The investment accounts we'd built over 30 years of careful saving, the life insurance, all of it, structured so that on my death, the assets would pass to Daniel directly, outside of any matrimonial property claim, completely legally, defensibly outside. She was specific about that matrimonial piece. I remember the afternoon she explained it to me over dinner. She said it without any particular drum, the way she said most hard things. Just quietly and clearly, the way you state a fact. If Daniel ends up with someone whose primary interest is what we've built, she said, I want to make sure that person cannot reach it. She wasn't thinking of anyone in particular. She didn't know Vanessa existed. She was just applying 15 years of professional observation to the problem of protecting her son. She was right to do it. She was right about almost everything. That was Margaret. She died 14 months after the diagnosis. I held her hand in the palliative ward at Health Sciences North on a Tuesday, morning in March. The lake ice still solid on Wabun. The birches outside the hospital window just beginning to think about spring. Before she lost consciousness for the last time, she said 2 things to me. She said, don't close up on Daniel. Let him live his life. Trust that we raised him right. And she said, the letter is in the fireproof box in the back closet. You'll know when. I said I understood. I meant both parts. But I also went to see Peter Gallagher the following week and asked him to look at everything Margaret had set up and tell me if there was anything to add. There was one thing. I added it. Daniel met Vanessa at a work conference in Toronto, about 8 months after his mother died. He called me from the hotel the same week to tell me about her. I was sitting on the back porch of the house in Timmins, watching the neighbor's dog investigate the fence line, drinking a beer I didn't really want. I listened to my son talk about this woman he'd met, how smart she was, how funny, how she'd come right up to him at the welcome reception and started talking like they were already old friends. He sounded the way he had at 17 when he bought a used car from a man he'd met at a gas station in New Liskeard. Excited, certain, already in love with the idea before he'd examined it properly. I kept that thought to myself. Margaret had told me I was too quick to distrust people, and she wasn't wrong, and I had made her a promise. Vanessa moved into Daniel's apartment in Mississauga 6 months after they met. I drove down to have dinner with them on a Sunday in February. The kind of cold Ontario night where the wind comes off the lake and reminds you that this province doesn't owe you anything. She was lovely, attentive in the way that certain people are attentive, fully, immediately, like a switch being thrown. She asked about my career, my years as a civil engineer, the house I kept in Timmins. And she asked about the lake house, where it was, how big it was, whether I still used it, whether it was winterized. I told her it was my wife's family's property, that we'd kept it out of sentimentality. Small, I said. Old, more trouble than it was worth, probably. She nodded sympathetically and moved the conversation on. But I noticed she'd asked 4 follow-up questions before she did. Over the next year, I noticed other things. The way she angled conversations toward finances. The way she would mention, very casually, like she was just making conversation, something Daniel had apparently told her about his mother's estate. The way she came alive whenever the topic drifted, toward property values or investment accounts or what I planned to do with the lake house. Long term, she never said anything overtly. She was far too careful for that. But there was a pattern, and once you've seen a pattern, you can't unsee it. Daniel proposed to her at Christmas. She said yes before he'd finished the sentence. I hugged them both and told them I was happy for them. That was half true. I was happy for Daniel, who was looking at her. The way you look at someone you believe is the answer to something. That part I understood. That part I recognized from my own life. But that evening, after dinner, while Daniel was doing the dishes, Vanessa sat across from me at the kitchen table in Mississauga and said very pleasantly, with her hands wrapped around a wine glass and a reasonable expression on her face, "We should probably start talking about estate planning as a family, just to make sure everyone's on the same page." I looked at her for a moment. "Absolutely," I said. "I'll set something up." I called Peter Gallagher first thing Monday morning. "I want to explain what the lake house actually contains, because it matters to the rest of the story. The property is on Waban Lake, about 3 hours north of Sudbury. Margaret's parents built the cabin in 1971, and she spent every summer of her childhood there. We took it on after her father died, kept it up, used it every August, and as many long weekends as we could manage. After Margaret died, I transferred the property into the trust, exactly as she'd specified. The deed was clean. The title was clean. Everything was in order. The house itself is modest. 3 bedrooms, a stone fireplace, a dock that needs replacing every 8 or 10 years, a back bedroom with a closet where we stored the things we didn't have room for anywhere else, photo albums, Christmas cards. Going back to 1987, a plastic bin of Daniel's hockey, medals for minor hockey, Margaret's gardening books, a fireproof document box. That box contained 3 things: a copy of our marriage certificate, a copy of Daniel's birth certificate, and an envelope with Daniel's name on it in Margaret's handwriting. Her careful, looping cursive, sealed and waiting. No financial records, no account statements, no trust documents, no information about investments or property values or the structure of anything. Those things lived with Peter Gallagher in a fireproof safe in a building with a security system in downtown Timmins. The lake house closet had birthday cards and hockey medals and a letter a woman wrote to her son because she wanted him to know he was loved. That was the vault. That was what was waiting. I thought about that a lot in the months between Christmas dinner and the Saturday in October. I thought about it every time. Daniel called and something in his voice had gone quieter. Every time our conversations had longer pauses than they used to. He was watching. He was starting to see something he hadn't named yet. And he was hoping, the way people do, that if he didn't name it, maybe it would turn out to be something else. In August, he told me 2 things that told me October was coming. He told me Vanessa had quit her marketing job. Not been let go, quit voluntarily, on the assumption, as best he could tell, that with the wedding approaching and my resources presumably in the picture, there wasn't any urgency to keep working. He'd been too surprised to push back in the moment, and by the time he told me it had been 6 weeks, and she'd shown no interest in finding anything new. And he told me she'd pulled the property assessment on the lake house from the municipal records website, found the estimated value, brought it up at dinner like a fun fact. "Did you know your dad's lake property is assessed at almost 400,000? She'd said. "That's wild." He told me he'd felt something shift in him when she said it. Not a dramatic shift, a quiet one. The kind that happens when you've been holding an explanation for something in your hand, and it suddenly doesn't fit anymore. I asked him if he'd talked to her about it. He said he was still thinking about what to say. I told him to take his time. I said there was no rush. I said the most important thing was being sure about what he was seeing before. He said anything he couldn't take back. What I meant was, I have already handled the parts that need handling. You just need to figure out your own heart. I also called Gerald. Gerald Bouchard had been managing the summer, maintenance on the lake house for 11 years. Replaced the dock boards, winterized the pipes, checked on the property after big storms. A quiet, reliable man who had never once given me a reason to doubt him. I told him there might be an unauthorized visit. I told him what to do if there was one. He said he understood. He didn't ask a lot of questions. Then I went home and waited. My phone rang on a Saturday morning in October. I was at my brother-in-law Ron's place in Sudbury, sitting on the porch with coffee going cold in my hand, watching the frost on the grass catch the early sun. Daniel's name came up on the screen and I answered on the second ring. The way you do when you're a father. And something in your gut tells you not to let it go to voicemail. "Dad." His voice was tight. The same tightness I'd heard in it the night his mother passed. "She's gone. She took the truck and she won't tell me where she went. I found the spare key missing, the one from the kitchen drawer. The one for the lake house." I set my coffee down very carefully on the porch railing. "How long ago?" "Maybe an hour. I tried calling, but she's not picking up." He paused. "Dad, I heard her on the phone with her sister last night. I wasn't trying to listen, I was just walking past the bedroom. But I heard her say, she said there had to be something valuable up there. She said you'd been hiding things." She used that word, hiding. I looked out at Ron's backyard. At the birch trees going yellow along the fence. At the ordinary Saturday. Morning continuing without any awareness of what was happening 3 hours north of us. "Don't call her again," I said. "Don't call the lake house. Just stay home." "Dad, what's up there?" "What is she going to find?" I thought about how to answer that. I thought about Margaret sitting across from Peter Gallagher 4 years ago, with her reading glasses on and her hands folded on the desk, telling him exactly what she wanted done and exactly why. "Nothing she can touch," I said. "I promise you that." There was a long pause on his end. "I'm sorry," Daniel said. I knew he wasn't apologizing for the phone call. His name is Daniel. He is 34 years old. He has his mother's eyes and his grandfather's stubbornness and, until quite recently, a remarkable inability to see people clearly when he loved them. That last part is not a criticism. Margaret was the same way. It was part of what made her so generous, so easy to take advantage of, and so deeply beloved by everyone who deserved her. The people who deserved her were many. She made sure of that. I got into my car and drove north. Not because there was anything at the lake house for Vanessa to take. I'd made sure of that years ago. Quietly and without any drama. The way you maintain a roof or service a furnace. You do it not because you think something will definitely go wrong, but because you understand the cost of being wrong if you didn't. I drove north because I felt it was right to be there, because the lake house was Margaret's place and I was not going to let what happened there happen without me present. I also called Peter Gallagher from a rest stop north of Sudbury. He picked up on the third ring, which for a Saturday was either luck or something like professional instinct. I told him what was happening. He said he understood and told me what I might need to know. I thanked him and kept driving. Gerald called me when I was about 40 minutes out. He said she'd arrived at 10 in the morning, driven up in Daniel's truck, apparently taken without asking. parked in the gravel drive, used the spare key from the kitchen drawer, the one Margaret had labelled with a piece of masking tape in blue marker, the word Wabun written on it in her handwriting. She'd let herself in like she owned the place. Gerald watched from the maintenance shed across the lane. He told me she spent 40 minutes inside. She went through the storage closet in the back bedroom. He could see movement through the window. She came out twice to check something in the truck and went back inside. On the second trip out, she was carrying what looked like a camera bag. She was photographing documents. I thanked Gerald and asked him to stay close but not to approach. I arrived at the lake house a little after 1 in the afternoon. The truck was in the drive. There was smoke coming from the stone fireplace. She'd made herself comfortable, enough to light a fire. I sat in my car for a moment and looked at that smoke rising thin and grey against the October sky. I thought about Margaret, who had loved that fireplace more than almost anything else about the property. She would spend entire November weekends reading beside it while the lake went silver outside. The windows and the loons called from the far shore. I got out of the car. I went inside. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her phone and a glass of water. And when she saw me come through the door, her face went through several expressions in quick succession before settling on something that was trying very hard to be casual. "Robert," she said, "I didn't know you were coming up." I could say the same, I said. I took off my coat and hung it on the hook by the door. Margaret had put that hook there. I sat down across from Vanessa at the table. "Is Daniel with you?" she asked. "No." "Oh, I wanted to see the place. I've only been up here once before. I thought it might be nice to start thinking about whether we could use the property for the wedding." "The key," I said. She stopped. "The key from Daniel's kitchen drawer. The masking tape one." "Where is it?" She reached into her jacket pocket and placed it on the table between us. I picked it up and put it in my own pocket. "I want to be straightforward with you," I said. "I think you deserve that." She was very still. The fire was going in the next room. You could hear it. "I know what you've been looking for," I said. "I know you pulled the property assessment from the municipal record site. I know you asked Daniel about his mother's estate on at least 4 separate occasions over the last year. I know you've been building a picture, trying to understand what exists, how it's structured, what it might be worth." I paused. "And I know that what you found in the back bedroom closet this morning was not what you were hoping to find." She opened her mouth. I continued. "The assets are in a family trust. They've been there for 4 years. Margaret set it up before she died, and I made one addition of my own earlier this year. The lake house is in that trust. The investment accounts are in that trust. When I'm gone, those assets transfer to Daniel directly, outside of any matrimonial property claim, by the terms of the trust instrument. Your marriage to Daniel would not change that. A divorce would not change that. The trust was structured specifically for this purpose. It was drafted by a lawyer. It has been reviewed, and it is not something that can be worked around." A long silence. She was composing herself. I could see her deciding which version of this conversation to try. "I wasn't trying to," she started. "I'm not angry," I said, and I meant it. "I'm not here to have a fight. I'm telling you how things stand so that you can make informed decisions. Whatever you were hoping to find here, it isn't here. Whatever picture you'd built in your mind, I'm asking you to set it aside and ask yourself honestly what you want your life with my son to look like." Another silence. Outside, Waboon Lake was flat and silver grey. A pair of loons had come in early from somewhere to the north and settled on the far shore. I'd seen them from the road on the way in. "Daniel is a good person," I said. "He's kind and he works hard, and he would do anything for someone he loves. He deserves to be with someone who sees that, just that, without the addition." I stood up. I took her water glass to the sink. "I'll wait outside while you collect your things," I said. "I'll drive the truck back to a point where you can get a cab, or I can call one for you now, whichever you prefer." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said quietly, "He doesn't know any of this." "About the trust." "He knows enough," I said. "He'll know everything when the time is right." I went outside and waited by my car. The loons called twice across the water. The birches along the south shore had gone almost bare. It was a beautiful afternoon, cold and clear. The kind of afternoon that makes northern Ontario look like something you'd want to keep. She came out 15 minutes later. She had her bag. She didn't have the camera bag anymore. Whatever she'd photographed was still on her phone, but she must have realized, somewhere in those 15 minutes, that it didn't matter. Birthday cards, school reports, Margaret's handwriting on the backs of old photographs. I drove her to the Tim Hortons in Gogama, and she got out without saying very much. I called her a cab and waited until it came. Then I drove back to the lake house and sat by the fire for a while and thought about Margaret. She left 3 weeks later on a Tuesday while Daniel was at work. She took her things and her car and left. A note on the kitchen counter that said she needed time to think. She didn't take anything that wasn't hers. She didn't make a scene. She didn't call a lawyer. She read the situation and she walked away from it cleanly. Whatever her reasons for coming into my son's life, her reasons for leaving were at least honest. I give her credit for that. I mean it. Daniel called me that night. He was quiet for a long time. I didn't try to fill the silence. Finally, he said, "Did you know this was going to happen?" "I didn't know," I said. "I thought it might." "Why didn't you tell me what you saw?" This was the question I'd been turning over for months. I had the answer ready, though I hadn't quite said it aloud before. "Because I could have been wrong," I said. "And because it needed to be something you came to yourself. I could protect what needed protecting, but I couldn't make you see something before you were ready. That part had to be yours." He was quiet again. Then he said, "She asked me last week if we could redo the prenuptial agreement. She said the lawyer who drafted it hadn't been fair to her." "What did you think?" I asked. "I thought I was tired," he said. "I've been tired for a long time. I thought about Margaret. I thought about the last good summer at the lake before the diagnosis, when the three of us had sat on the dock past midnight, watching the Perseids, and Daniel had said he couldn't imagine ever being happier than he was at that exact moment. His mother had laughed and told him to keep that feeling close, that it would come back. "Come up to the lake," I said. "Next weekend. I want to show you something." We went up on a Friday in November. The water was still and cold and a deep, serious blue, the kind it gets when the season has turned for good and there's no more warmth left in it. The birches along the south shore had gone bare. The loons were still there on the far side, the same pair I'd seen in October. I'd looked it up, and apparently Wabun holds heat longer than the surrounding lakes, which keeps them around later than most people expect. We stopped at the grocery store in Chapleau, and I bought lamb shoulder and the vegetables for the stew Margaret used to make every fall. Daniel carried the groceries in from the truck without me asking. He walked through the door of the lake house and stood for a moment in the main room, the way you stand somewhere that contains a lot of years. Then he hung his coat on the hook Margaret had put there and went to put the kettle on. We built a fire in the stone fireplace. I made the lamb stew from memory, which took longer than it used to because I kept stopping to remember where the next step came from. Daniel sat at the kitchen table and we talked while I cooked, slowly at first and then more naturally. The way we used to talk when he was young, when conversation had no agenda, just two people in the same room, following the thread wherever it went. We ate at the kitchen table. Outside the windows, the lake went dark in the early evening. A single light from a cottage on the north shore was reflected on the water, stretching and shifting. After dinner, I went to the back bedroom. I opened the closet. I took the fireproof box off the shelf. The same box, the same masking tape label in Margaret's handwriting, and brought it to the kitchen table and set it in front of Daniel. He looked at it. Then he looked at me. "Your mother left that for you," I said. "She told me I'd know when the time was right." I sat down across from him. He didn't reach for the box immediately. He looked at it for a moment the way you look at something you've been half afraid of for years. Then he opened it. He took out the marriage certificate. He set it aside. He took out the birth certificate. He set it beside the first one. And then he picked up the envelope with his name on it, his mother's careful looping cursive, and held it in both hands. I stood up and went to stand by the window so he could have the room. I heard the envelope open. I heard him breathing. The loons called from somewhere out on the dark water, their sound carrying clean and far across the lake the way it does in November, when there's nothing left between you and the far shore. I don't know exactly what she wrote. He hasn't told me and I haven't asked. That belongs to him. She meant it to. I heard him behind me for a long time, not moving, just breathing. And when I finally turned around, his eyes were wet and he was holding the letter with both hands. The way you hold something you're not ready to set down. She knew, he said. She knew a lot of things, I said. He folded the letter very carefully and put it back in the envelope. He held it against his chest for a moment. Then he set it beside the marriage certificate and the birth certificate and looked at the three of them together on the table. I made another pot of coffee. We sat up until almost midnight talking about his mother, about the summers here, about things he remembered and things I remembered that he'd forgotten, about what came next and how you find your footing after a year, like the one he'd had. About nothing in particular and everything important. The fire went on in the next room. The lake was the same as it had always been, patient and cold and entirely unimpressed by the troubles of the people who came and went along its shores. That was enough. That was, in the end, everything. There are things you build in a life that have nothing to do with money. Account balances, property assessments, trust instruments. These are real things, useful things. I'm not dismissing them. They did exactly what Margaret designed them to do. But the thing Vanessa came looking for in the back closet of my wife's lake house, hoping to find the key to something worth taking, was never there. It could never have been there, because it doesn't have a lock. It's just a boy who grew up knowing he was loved. It's just a father who kept his promise. It's just a letter in an envelope in a fireproof box, waiting in a closet for 20 years for exactly the right November night. Margaret understood that this was the only inheritance that would last. She was right. She usually was. People sometimes ask me whether I feel any satisfaction about how things turned out, whether I enjoyed watching it all come apart. The honest answer is no. There was nothing enjoyable about any of it. Watching your son love someone the wrong way, knowing what's coming and not being able to shortcut his path to seeing it. That is not a satisfying thing to live through. It is just hard. You do what you can and you wait. What I've come to understand, after 64 years of watching people and their choices, is that the outcomes in our lives are not random. They grow directly from what we do, and more importantly, from what we decide to be. Vanessa made a series of choices. She chose to look at a grieving family and see an opportunity. She chose to photograph a dead woman's birthday cards, looking for leverage. She chose to ask questions she already knew the shape of the answers to. Every one of those choices was a brick in a wall she built around herself, without fully realizing it. And when the moment came, that wall had nowhere to fall but inward. I made choices too. Margaret and I both did. We chose to build things carefully. We chose honesty with each other and with our lawyers and with the structures we put in place. We chose to protect Daniel, not by sheltering him from every hard thing, but by making sure that when the hard thing arrived, the ground beneath him would hold. That's the only kind of protection that actually works. You cannot guard someone from experience. You can only make sure they have something solid to stand on while they go through it. Daniel made choices as well, and I think that matters more than anything else in this story. He chose, eventually, to stop explaining away what he was seeing. He chose to feel the tiredness he'd been carrying and to name it. That took more courage than most people would give him credit for. It is not easy to walk toward a truth that costs you something. It is not easy to sit at your mother's table on a November night and open a letter you've been half afraid of for years. He did those things. He did them himself. I handed him the box. He was the one who opened it. There are things you can pass on to your children through money and property. A well-drafted trust, a lake house maintained for 30 years, an investment account structured by a woman who understood the law and the limits of love and the difference between the two. Those are real gifts. I don't dismiss them. But the thing that actually carries a family forward, from one generation to the next, is something quieter. It is the example of how you treated people. It is the record of whether you told the truth. It is a letter a woman wrote by hand to her son because she wanted him to know. when the time came, that he was seen clearly and loved completely. Not for what he might inherit, not for what he might become, for exactly who he already was. Margaret understood that. She understood it better than I did, and she made sure to leave evidence of it behind. That is the only inheritance that cannot be photographed, cannot be transferred, cannot be reached by any instrument a lawyer can draft against it. You carry it in you or you don't, and if you're lucky, if you raised your child the way we tried to raise ours, they carry it too, long after the lake house is gone and the accounts are settled, and there is nothing left to argue over. That is what remains. I think about that on quiet mornings at the lake now. I think about the loons on the water and the fire in the next room, and my son reading his mother's handwriting in the dark. I think that she would have been pleased. Not with all of it. She would have been sad about the year Daniel lost. She would have been sad about Vanessa. Not angry, just sad. The way she was sad about anyone who chose smallness when something larger was available to them. But she would have been pleased that what she built held, pleased that when it mattered the ground was solid, pleased that the letter reached him at the right time, in the right place by the right fire. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.